Nothing is more pervasive or irrational than war. Like murder, all of the explanations for it never rises to the level of actual logic. The so-called need for Lebensraum or living space, that drove Germans to wage a Second World War, if patently absurd. Even the anti-Semitic arguments that Germany was so plagued by nefarious Jews they had to go to extraordinary lengths to free themselves of this pestilence, verge on idolization. That a few million Jews could so dominate an entire nation that it takes a world war to unseat them, gives powers to the Jewish race that ought to be reserved for supermen. But there is nothing new about immigrants having an impact on their host country that is disproportionate to their actual numbers. Those who choose to immigrate usually do so because they have a determination and purpose far beyond that which is likely to be found in the average citizen. When we were all subsistence hunter-gatherers, we actually did need living space. The reaping of a population could not exceed the capacity of nature to reproduce. But this is not even true in the context of a population because our ability to glean is limited. A man can only travel so far to hunt. A woman could only go so far to pick berries and find edible roots. So the range of the camp was limited to the distance that could be traveled while sustaining the needs of the camp. Another factor came into play, also. The men could not all be gone on lengthy hunts because the camp had to be guarded. So, generally, an area incapable of sustaining human predation long, was gleaned until the area was no longer producing a sufficient return on the labor expended. At which time the camp uprooted and moved to a new area. Thus, a tribe could not just restrict itself to defending its immediate area, it had to protect those areas that were regenerating and would be needed at some future date. War, or what might better be described as tribal conflicts, were necessary to force people to inhabit new areas and spread across the globe. North America, for example, was peopled largely by the losers in wars for the Russian steppes. When the same resource, such as hunting grounds, is claimed by different groups, conflict appears inevitable and, from the perspective of the combatants, just. No one fights a war because they wish to promote greater injustice. No one fights a war as a way to demonstrate how evil they are. Wars are justified and often given divine legitimacy by the religious leaders of the nations at war. No one says God is against this war, but we will wage it anyway. The inexhaustible ability of man to justify what he wants to do, is a problem. But this is not to say war is never justified. At the same time, we have to conclude that only one nation can be justified in any given conflict. Both warring nations cannot be fighting a just war. But deciding who fights the just war and who is in the wrong, is not as easy as some suppose. A simple rule is that the aggressor nation is wrong. It is not hard to see that Japan was in the wrong when it attacked the US at Pearl Harbor. It is reasonable to apply these same rules to the two conflicts going on now, which are the Israeli and Palestine conflict and the Ukraine and Russia conflict. In these two wars, Palestine attacked Israel and Russia attacked Ukraine. So technically these two countries are in the wrong. They do not see things this way, however. Palestine claims Israel has been provoking a confrontation for years, whereas Russia argues Ukraine is a hub for child sex trafficking and does not have a legitimate government. The present government, they say, is the product of a coup. The common response to these situations in which two opposing viewpoints are expressed and two sets of data are offered in defense of the different sides, is to investigate the reasonableness of the claims. This is a balanced and reasoned response, but one doomed to fail. The investigator is not likely to uncover any new data, and even if new information is uncovered, it is not likely to be weighted in the way the researcher would like it to be. In other words, the two sides have both looked at the issue and the data before the conflict was started. Both sides have probably been aware of the issues and information for a long time, as it involves them. The information the researcher uncovers is not only known by the combatants, but analyzed and interpreted by the combatants in such a way as to make war a reasonable response. The researcher is not likely to find things so one-sided that the combatants will abandon their own position to adopt fully the position of the researcher. Ukraine will deny they are an unelected government or have any more child sex traffickers than any comparable nation. Israel will put forward its evidence proving Israel was unjustly attacked, though Israel has always been the Jewish homeland. Palestine will in response provide evidence to show the people of Israel are not descendants of the biblical Jews nor a people with any right to the land. They will also accentuate their own ancestral ties to the land. The researcher might find conclusive evidence that one side or the other is wrong, but both sides have too much riding on the conflict's outcome to simply give up and hand victory to the other side. After all, wars are usually about land or territory, and territory is life. Without a place to call one's own, one has nothing. Anyone can see that if you live on an island and a group comes to the island and claims it as their own, this is a serious threat to your existence. Most people would not blame you for fighting to defend what is yours. But what if you have a home and someone decides they want to move into it, or actually begin to live in it claiming squatter rights? Most people would see this as wrong, but the level of violence they think is appropriate to evict the interloper will vary. The issue becomes even more complicated if we are talking about someone taking a chocolate bar you own. What steps can you take to reclaim a minor piece of property? The Bible says sin is sin and all evil is the same in God's eyes, but as humans we think there are different forms of crime and there ought to be different responses to it. It seems the most reasonable thing in the world to see murder as a different category of wrong from stealing, especially petty theft. Yet, it is all crime. Even so, we complicate things even further by treating a child's crime as a substantially different thing from a crime committed by an adult, despite the crime being identical. The problem we have as pacifists, besides being associated with passivity, is that we generally react to overt acts of violence, but in ways that only those who share many of our views are sympathetic with. People who see violence as a solution are not swayed by pacifist arguments. Violence is only seen as bad by people who do not view violence as a preferred option. It is unproductive to tell a bully that being a bully is wrong, when being a bully has allowed the bully to achieve his goals. In some ways, asserting that violence is not the answer, only reaffirms that violence is the answer, for those who see it as a solution. If a victim tries to tell the oppressor that violence is wrong, the oppressor is only going to see violence as being disliked by the victim because the victim knows it works and has no countermeasures to it. People are constantly asking each other when the West started to go downhill morally, when did we lose our way, spiritually? I suggest it was immediately after World War II when we let Germany walk free and clear of their crimes. Virtually nothing was done regarding Germany's war crimes any more than we have done nothing about Islam. The West lost its moral bearing and intellectual credibility. When we no longer feel obliged to demand justice for the worst crimes against humanity, we no longer have a right to call out others for egregious behavior. Turning a blind eye to the evilest of persons and despicable agendas becomes easier after we let Germany and Islam continue on without ever demanding an accounting. It is easy to understand evil. Evil persons are essentially infants. Despite being adults physically and often capable people, they are spiritual infants. As a consequence, they need the care of a spiritually mature person. Infants cannot take care of themselves. Physical children are the next generation, but they are unable to care for themselves. The immature must be looked after by the mature as we were cared for when we were at that stage in our development. However, the problem is that the physically mature are able to wrest what they want from others. This is what makes them parasites. They believe their need justifies their expropriations. But it cannot. But the parasite has an ally in the state, for the productive person has no need for the state, but the parasitic person does. The state allies itself with parasites to gain and share power. This is done to expropriate wealth from the productive sector. We fight wars to retain rights over our property when this is threatened by parasites. Of course, parasite fights parasites, and so when nations war, the parasites of the beleaguered nation fight alongside the assets. But war is always fought against parasitic incursions, to protect the property of the nation. The reason why we have wars, however, is because we have domestic parasites, and this makes us susceptible to challenges by foreign parasites. To end war, we need to end parasitism everywhere. Only the Church can do this, and it can only do this way Christians unite ecumenically.